2014. WRTD is the largest day of responsible tourism action in the world. It is not only the many sessions and exhibitor involvement on the exhibition floor, but what is taking place in the many communities around the world under the banner of WRTD. Hopefully, you will be able to see some of those examples of those participating projects on the screen behind me. I'm proud to say that these projects are taking place quite literally all over the world, including Argentina, Cuba, Thailand, Tanzania, Morocco, Pakistan, Armenia, and here in the UK. And as if by magic, I can see that they're there. Responsible tourism is the backbone of this industry. It helps us to give back to struggling communities, to conserve amazing biodiversity, stunning scenery, extraordinary heritage, and teeming wildlife. And that's why I believe WTM's Responsible Tourism Programme across full 4 days of the event for the first time is so important, helping to inspire, encourage, educate, and motivate, bringing a range of presentations, seminars, and debates with a lineup of experts and experienced industry executives that will help us tease out the problems, explain new thinking, and probe possible solutions. I am pleased that the industry at large is taking responsible tourism seriously. We can see this through many great examples of responsible tourism practices rightly highlighted by the World Responsible Tourism Awards at WTM, which will be awarded later on in this session. We want to be completely open and frank with you. We want to present the facts directly and honestly. We aim to show you both sides of the argument. Above all, we provide the platform to facilitate positive change within the industry. As I said last year, and feel that it's still so applicable again for this year, make no mistake, these sessions are not about the niceties of life, not about just patting ourselves on the back. WTM does this throughout the year on our Responsible Tourism blog and our Spotlight features. You may not be aware, but we have also extended the World Responsible Tourism Programme throughout the WTM portfolio, which also includes WTM Latin America, WTM Africa, and Arabian Travel Market. Here today, this year's key responsible tourism theme is animal protection. I'm delighted to welcome back to WTM Charlie Mayhew, CEO of conservation charity Tusk. Charlie was a hugely popular speaker at WTM in 2012. His thought-provoking and controversial headline speech was one of the most talked about presentations we've had at World Responsible Tourism Day. I do not think those of us that were there will ever forget the picture of that slaughtered elephant. Joining Charlie is Colin Bell, co-founder of Wilderness Safaris. They'll discuss how Africa, the tourism industry, and the world at large responds to a crisis that has already this year seen more than 618 rhino killed in South Africa. The figure is more than were poached in the Kruger Park, the epicenter of the problem during the whole of 2013. I'm sure Stephen will ask Colin's proposal that a 1% levy should be charged on all tourism accommodation and related services in South Africa to support a natural capital fund dedicated at addressing the issue. Before I hand the floor to BBC journalist Stephen Sacker to kick off today's proceedings, I want to take this opportunity to highlight ABTA's animal welfare guidelines. In the absence of any global laws on the keeping of animals for tourism, ABTA and the Born Free Foundation have produced global welfare guidelines for animals in tourism, which offers a benchmark for the minimum requirements of animal welfare. I'm sure that this is an area that will come up again in the debate. We are now pleased to provide a platform for Secretary-General of UNWTO, Taleb Rifai, our partners in World Responsible Tourism Day, and the Moroccan Minister of Tourism, His Excellency Lassen Haddad, to launch the 10-year framework of programs for sustainable tourism. Taleb, if I may, I'd like to now hand over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming in so fresh, full of energy this morning. We're delighted to see the room so full of people that we value and we cherish their contribution. My very good friend, Lassen Haddad, Minister of Tourism of Morocco, it's a pleasure to be with you all the time. I still recall our event in Morocco a few weeks ago, and I carry great, great memories of all the work that we jointly do together. Thank you for being with us. Simon, it's great to have this partnership between you and WTO and World Travel Market and the good and fruitful results that are coming out of that. My very good friend, Harold Goodwin, thank you. You have been the champion and you have been the leader. You dedicated your time, your energy for World Tourism Day, for World Responsible Tourism Day and the events that come out of it. Baroness, ladies and gentlemen, all distinguished guests, my dear friend Stephen, I'm delighted to be here this morning. It is my great pleasure to officially launch on this occasion the program of sustainable tourism of the 10-year framework of program on sustainable consumption and production patterns, the 10YFP. We're very good at the United Nations system to create acronyms that sometimes are very difficult to people to understand. So I'll try to make a little bit of clarity on this one. The 10YFP is one of the 6 programs that was set as a result of the Rio Plus 20 conference that was held 2 years ago, where heads of states committed to transform how our societies consume and produce their services and their goods around. And UNWTO has been honored and privileged lately to be the leading agency that, together with the governments of Morocco, France, and the Republic of Korea, are going to be leading the 10YFP program on the tourism sector. The 10YFP Secretariat is hosted by the United Nations Environmental Program, and this is a new UN initiative for sustainable tourism. I hope that clarifies the acronym a little bit. It's a program that is set to harness the power of the 1 billion tourists that travel the world every year and turn it into a force for good. Because, my dear friends, travel and tourism today has become the largest, one of the largest and fastest growing economies in the world. 9% of world GDP comes from travel and tourism. 1 out of 11 jobs all over the world. 6 to 7% of total world trade is from travel and tourism, and over 30% in trade and services all over the world is from travel and tourism. In 2013, international tourist arrivals reached 1,087 million international tourists in one single year. Add to that 6 billion people that traveled within their boundaries. That makes 1 out of 7 international travelers every year making a trip outside of their national boundaries, and almost every person in this world making a trip, whether outside or inside of his own country, his or her own country. This is consistent with our forecast that we have led in the UNWTO, the 2030 study that predicts that by the year 2030, we will have 1.8 billion international travelers crossing borders in a single year. Yet, this is exactly where the challenge lies, because with this exceptional growth of this industry that has grown in spite of so many obstacles, this presents a challenge of how to manage it and how to make sure that it becomes a force for good. Because if not, the 1 billion international travelers will not be 1 billion opportunities for good, but will turn, God forbid, into 1 billion disasters. We have to be up to the challenge of the increased resources use, the degradation of the natural and cultural heritage, and the negative impact that tourism may have on social impacts. If we do not talk about the dark side and the downside of tourism, we will not be responsible. We cannot only talk about the good part and the bright part, which it is, and which are capable of making this industry rise up to that level. Without proper management, tourism can deplete natural resources, lead to water shortages, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, and contribute to climate change, among other impacts that can be even more shocking than this when it comes to the exploitation of people and human beings. The UN Green Economy report shows that if we continue business as usual, the scenario for tourism growth rate up until the year 2050 will result in the following: a significant increase in energy consumption of over 154%. Greenhouse emissions will increase 131%, water consumption will increase 152%, and solid waste disposal will increase 251%. So we simply cannot continue business as usual, and we need to act now. The 10YFP aims to achieve major shifts in tourism policies and stimulate greater sustainability within the tourism supply chain. It will work on issues of resource efficiency, management effectiveness, and the use of new technologies to promote sustainable consumption and production patterns. Such ambitious objectives can only strive with a strong cooperation amongst all stakeholders, and that's at the core of this initiative. For this reason, 10YFP is a collaborative program involving governments, in the core of this, of course, private sector, NGOs, and many other stakeholders. Tourism is indeed a complex network of value chains where each of us has a fundamental role to play and where each action counts. 1 billion tourism travelers, international travelers, means 1 billion opportunities. Every single act that we do can and should be seen as multiplied by 1 billion. You can see the impact of this over the society and over the environment, people and planet. Allow me then to take this opportunity to invite all of you to join us in this very exciting and important initiative and to be part of the biggest international effort ever being built in the area of sustainable tourism. Your experience, each and every one of you here interested and enthusiastically coming to this meeting today, in how resource efficiency and low-carbon tourism, in reducing the loss of biodiversity, in conserving ecosystems, in preserving cultural heritage and adapting to realities of changing climate, can contribute to make this program a success. It is now my great, great pleasure to invite a very valuable partner and a good friend, representing a country that has been in the lead. In New York, in the General Assembly, I was just sharing with the minister from Morocco, their ambassador there has been submitting one resolution after another that encourages all nations around the world to support sustainable tourism development. It gives me great pleasure, therefore, to invite His Excellency Dr. Lahseen Haddad, Minister of Tourism of Morocco, one of the 3 countries that are co-leading the 10YFP together with France and Korea, to represent all of us here and to ask him to say a few words in this regard. I thank you all very much for being with us this morning, and it gives me great pleasure now to give the floor to Minister Lahseen Haddad. Thank you.
Good morning. My dear friend, Dr. Talib Rifai, Secretary General of United Nations World Tourism Organization, dear ministers, honorable ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted to be here this morning. The world travel market is one of the leading events in the travel and tourism calendar, and it's being held at a critical time for the industry as it starts to discuss the impacts of tourism can have on environment, culture, and people. Tourism's substantial dependency on intact social, cultural, and natural environment has triggered a strong strategic interest to push forward sustainable development in a holistic way. Over the last 20 years, the general interest and engagement of key stakeholder groups in sustainable tourism and tourism practices and policies has increased substantially and considerably. And due to the increase in economic importance of tourism for both developing and developed countries, sustainable tourism, including ecotourism, has been recognized as a key vehicle for sustainable development by world leaders and has been identified as one of the 6 programs under the 10-year framework program. Sustainable tourism program supports cooperation between stakeholders for the development and implementation of innovative projects and good practices. And this concerns, as my dear friend Talib Rifai said, resource-efficient and low-carbon tourism planning, reducing the loss of biodiversity, conserving ecosystems, preserving cultural heritage, alleviating poverty, improving sustainable livelihoods, and adapting to the reality of a changing climate. The development of the 10YFP program on sustainable tourism capitalized on previous initiatives and experiences. One of the experiences it's capitalized on is that of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Tourism that emerged in 2001 as a successor to the International Task Force on Sustainable Tourism. Capitalizing on its role as president of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Tourism, Morocco, through the Ministry of Tourism, commits to contributing to the global dynamics that aim at incorporating tourism in sustainability. Moroccan Ministry of Tourism and the government of Morocco is co-lead in this program in collaboration with South Korean Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, the French Ministry of Ecology, Sustainable Development and Energy, and the World Tourism Organization as the program lead. This devotion confirms the commitment of our country as regards sustainability. It rhymes with our ambition to become a reference country in the Mediterranean basin with regard to sustainable development within the framework of the objectives of the tourism strategy that we call Vision 2020. So it is with great honor that we continue this commitment by taking together an active part in this very important program. We commit to putting in more efforts in order to confirm the efficiency of our partnership and by proving that tourism constitutes a progress indicator as regards sustainability. We work together, we will do this together, all of this, and then by taking into account the principles of consumption and sustainable production as put forward by the UN, the Program for Environment, and also by all the efforts of the different countries and partners. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, I have the great pleasure in opening the 8th WTM World Responsible Tourism Day in association with the UNWTO. Welcome. And after that short fanfare, I'm delighted to pass you over to BBC Hard Talk presenter Stephen Sacker to introduce the speakers in more detail. Thank you very much and have a great day. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm looking for the trumpeters somewhere in the back. That fanfare was outstanding. Yeah, good morning, everybody. It is a real pleasure for me to be back here. For those of you who've been at World Responsible Tourism events before, you'll know that I keep rolling back year after year, mostly because I just think this day is really important. It matters a lot to me, and I hear every year so many wonderful stories about great initiatives, great projects and work being done all around the world by people who believe that there can be tourism done in a responsible, sustainable way that is in harmony with the planet that we have and that we need to sustain. So we're going to hear lots more about some of those wonderful projects over the next hour or so, because of course we've got the World Responsible Tourism Awards to come, and I know many of you are sitting nervously in your seats waiting to know whether you have won one of our gold awards this year, and all of that's going to come very soon. Before we do that, though, we're going to have what I hope is going to be an extremely interesting and important conversation about conservation, about trying to ensure that we, as a species, the human beings, we can find ways of ensuring that some of the most magnificent creatures on our planet are given the space to continue to survive and, one hopes, to thrive as well. I'm talking about elephants, rhinos, lions as well. Magnificent creatures that people pay enormous amounts of money to go and see in the wild, in their natural habitat, but which are right now increasingly under existential threat for all sorts of reasons that we're about to discuss. And tourism is a very important part of what is happening to those creatures, and it may be an important part of some positive solutions that we can come up with as well. That is sort of what we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so. So please welcome onto this stage two men with fantastic experience and insight into this question of how to go about saving these endangered species. Please give a very warm welcome to Charlie Mayhew, who is the CEO of the Tusk Conservation and Campaigning Organization, and to Colin Bell, who for more than 2 decades ran Wilderness Safaris, a company committed to responsible safari tourism, and who now is an independent campaigner working toward responsible tourism and management of wildlife in Africa. So please welcome both onto the stage right now. Gentlemen, if you would. Charlie, if you take a seat in the middle here, and Colin, if you go over to that seat over there. Thank you both for making the effort to be here today. I know you believe this day is an important one. And I want, in essence, I want you to, with both of your sets of experiences, to tell us how profound a problem you think these particular animals, these creatures face right now, and then we can talk about how best human beings can respond to the challenge of ensuring these creatures have a future. But the scale of the problem is what I want to start with. So Charlie, we're talking elephants, rhinos, maybe we're talking other species as well, but let's start with elephants and rhinos. How would you characterize the scale of the problem today?
Stephen, the scale of the problem is enormous, and I don't think that the world has truly woken up to this yet. I know the media has been talking about it, but if you look at the statistics of what's happening to elephant populations and rhino populations in particular, we can come on to the others in a minute, but it is truly shocking. Back in 1979, there was something like 1.3 million elephants in Africa. By 1989, that had gone down to something in the region of 700,000, and today we're losing in a region of 30,000 elephants to poachers every year for their ivory. And that has, I think most experts feel that the elephant population in Africa is now in the region of 400,000. It's difficult to be very accurate, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out the mass of where this is heading.
But despite all of the fine words that come from so many African governments now about cracking down on the poaching problem and also creating more and more national parks and safe spaces for elephants and rhinos, are you suggesting that the reduction in numbers is actually getting worse?
In some parts of Africa, the poaching is getting worse and is effectively out of control. In other parts, actually probably most notably Kenya's poaching appears to be subsiding or under a degree of control, in the sense that although they're still losing a lot of animals, the Kenyan government, the Kenyan Wildlife Service, and a lot of private operators have invested huge sums of money into security, which has certainly helped. But across the African continent, the slide is going one way down, and that's a huge concern. There's, it's not just about poaching. Loss of habitat is also another huge issue.
Well, I want to talk about that balance between the threat posed by poaching and the threat posed by other forms of human behavior, which aren't directly connected to the trade in ivory. But before we get to that, Colin, we've focused mostly on the elephant so far. You have a background in South Africa, and we heard from Simon at the very beginning that the numbers in terms of rhinos being killed for horn this year are pretty appalling. I mean, hundreds killed already this year. Give me a sense across the piece of what is happening to the rhino.
Well, let's try and contextualize the whole story. Since we started, since Simon kicked off, we've had 2 elephants killed, and since we woke up this morning, 1 rhino is dead. Every 15 minutes, bang, an elephant dies. Every 8 hours, bang, a rhino dies. So last year we had officially 1,004 rhinos poached, but that doesn't include the calves which are byproducts of the cull, or the poaching. It doesn't include the ones we don't see. So the official number is 1,004 rhinos, but it's probably 1,300 rhinos were killed last year. And that means that we're starting to breed fewer rhinos than are being poached. So we've reached the tipping point. We're now starting to go down in our numbers. And same with elephants. Elephants, we're having more elephants poached than are being born. So if this trend continues, we're going to have nothing left.
Yeah, you guys so far have both focused on poaching. Would it be the case that if the worldwide ban on the ivory trade meant anything, and if one could just click a finger and magically say, okay, there'll be no more poaching from now on, would that solve the problem? Would these 2 species no longer be endangered? Or is there something about the growth of human populations, the taking away of natural habitats, and perhaps we can talk about tourism too. Is there something else going on about human behaviors in Africa which means even if poaching were magically solved, the problem would still exist?
I think the problem would continue if the tourism industry didn't reform. Tourism industry has got the ability to be the savior, or it has the ability to be the destroyer. The problem is the last sort of 30 years policies aren't going to see us through the next 30 years. So we're right at the tipping point also in the tourism industry. If the tourism industry embraces communities, it embraces change, we have a real opportunity for tourism to be the sole provider of the solution.
But hang on, are you suggesting that for the last 30 years, the tourism industry has actively exacerbated the problem facing elephants and rhinos?
Not throughout Africa. There are some fantastic good examples. Namibia, for instance, Botswana, and extraordinary success stories where in Namibia, for instance, 1/4 of the country is set aside for conservancies which embrace communities, governments, NGOs, and the private sector. 1/4 of the country. So something like 18% of the country is formally preserved through the national parks, but 40-something% of the entire country is under wildlife management, which is properly conserved because the communities are involved with the tourism industry and the wildlife industry. And when the communities are involved, then you have a real chance of success. Botswana, another success story. 17% of the country formally set aside. 40% of the country is actually set aside for wildlife through that partnership between communities, business, governments. And it's that combination of when they all come together, tourism can be the absolute provider of success. If the tourism industry is out of sync with communities and the sustainable practices throughout the industry, tourism can be the destroyer.
Give me some, for examples of where tourism has had a negative effect. I'm thinking in terms of, the building of lodges, the taking away of habitats, the sort of creation of fences and walls, which stops animals roaming in the way that they might want to. Just explain to me how, done badly, tourism can be a negative.
Okay, I don't want to particularly mention the reserve, but there's one reserve in Africa where the water is something like 5,000 times too toxic to touch for a human being. It is so toxic. And the only reason it's toxic because all the lodges up the stream have not got proper sewage systems. They haven't got any sort of processing. So all the grey water which goes into the rivers which the wildlife has to depend on is so toxic that we are not allowed to touch it. How are the wildlife supposed to survive in that situation? They do somehow, but the numbers are going down. And we've seen this massive drop-off. It's not just tigers, it's not just lions, it's the entire spectrum in many areas where the wildlife has gone down when tourism is out of sync of what it should be doing. We need a wholesale reform. And you know, things like solar, for instance. There's no need for a remote area place for a lodge or a hotel to have a generator these days. Think of the carbon emission and all the rest of it. We need proper sewage systems. And many, many tourist facilities do not have those systems. Some of these lodges started 30, 40 years ago, and they've still got the same systems from 30, 40 years ago. And it's just wrong.
I want to come back to more positive ideas you have for the way tourism can manage its responsibilities in these areas where these endangered species live, if not thrive. But just sticking with the problems today for a moment longer, Charlie, there are, I dare say, I don't know if they're here today, but there are tourism ministers representing governments that have still significant populations of elephants on their territory who come to events like this and they say, we are totally across this. You know, we are absolutely committed to conservation. We're working with communities. We've ring-fenced national parks and conservancy territories. We are conducting anti-poaching operations. But the problem is that when you pick away at the reality of what happens in these countries, and I'll name a couple that I have experience with on my show, Hard Talk, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, pick away at what actually happens and you find that poachers are tied to organized criminal gangs who are tied to senior politicians, to senior people in the security services, to international criminal syndicates. And these are powerful forces that no amount of fine words can overcome. So why should we believe in the political commitment of the countries in which you work?
Well, I absolutely accept what you're saying, and I think that you know, the scale of the problem is so huge, and you rightly point out that the illegal wildlife trade, which obviously includes ivory and rhino horn, you know, is on a global stage is now worth, you know, something like $18 billion a year. It's enormous, and unfortunately, it is being driven by international criminal syndicates, in some cases linked to terrorism organizations. There's increasing evidence of that, that organizations like Al-Shabaab, Lords of Resistance Army, M23, you know, and so on and so forth, who have been exploiting mercilessly the illegal wildlife trade in order to, you know, gain the funds to operate. Now, the poachers on the ground, the little guys, if you like, you know, who are risking their lives to kill that elephant or rhino, there are plenty of them from where they come from. And, you know, what we are beginning to see is increased penalties across the African judiciary, which is great. But what is hugely worrying is that we're not seeing the kingpins of these criminal organizations, the middlemen and the kingpins who are controlling this trade. They still have a layer of protection around them. And, you know, and that's where we've got to pressurize governments, and it's not just African governments, it's also the consumer nations in the Far East as well. We've got to pressurize these governments to come down hard on these individuals. We've got to remove that protection from these individuals. And I think that, you know, I think it's also, you know, we have to realize that in Africa, you know, unfortunately, conservation and preserving, you know, the wildlife and habitats of Africa is not yet high enough up the agenda, political agenda, for most governments. They have huge issues, whether it be education, healthcare, or, you know, so on and so forth. But, you know, if you look at a country like Kenya, its tourism business, I think, is worth something like $3.5 billion a year. If that tourism business comes under threat, you know, it's worth 12% of its GDP or something. You know, that will have a significant impact on Kenya and on employment. And the connections run, if you know, take the connections right the way through, if the tourism is threatened because of insecurity in Kenya, which we're seeing now, then employment of hundreds of, you know, thousands of people in Kenya come under threat. And if that's the case, if you look at something like the Masai Mara, where there's fantastic community conservation programs around the Mara where the Maasai have chosen to engage in conservation and to adopt ecotourism as their way to generate revenue. If that revenue starts to come under threat, they will look for alternative land use and they will sell out to wheat farmers or cultivation or whatever it is, and that land will be lost to wildlife, and once it's lost forever.
And the elephant, for example, will therefore become their enemy in a way that, for the moment, it's still, for many of them, an ally because it helps the tourism business, but if tourism numbers aren't there, then they'll want to cultivate, and the elephant will be an obstacle.
We have to make, we have to demonstrate to, not just national parks, but, again, sorry to keep on using Kenya, but 70% of Kenya's wildlife lives outside national parks. It has a huge opportunity for those communities to benefit from tourism and to use tourism and conservation as a tool for poverty alleviation. But as I say, if that comes under greater threat and we lose that tourism and we lose security in some of these countries, all of that can be lost.
There is a fundamental paradox here, though, that we all, and I must admit, I've taken my family on holiday to Kenya to see the wildlife, and we had the most fabulous experience of our lives, and we loved it. But even then, and even more so sitting on this stage today, it strikes me the paradox is this, that, we want to see these magnificent creatures in their natural habitat. We want to see them genuinely in the wild, but the more airplanes that carry more and more people to these wild places to allow us to enjoy that spectacular vision, the more impossible it is to sustain the truly wild nature of those places in the long term. And I wonder, Colin, whether you accept any responsibility for your 2 decades in the safari business, any responsibility you would accept for trying to achieve the impossible, showing more and more people something truly wild, and therefore making it less wild and less sustainable.
Well, let's try and put that in context. Africa, when you get the map of Africa, you can put the whole of China, the whole of the US, the whole of Europe, and the whole of Asia, India, into the map of Africa. It's this extraordinary continent.
Yeah, but the territories where people want to go to see the big five are not that big.
Yeah, but if you think about where we are and the size we've only got 5% of the world tourism. Our biggest problem is that we don't have enough tourism, but we don't have enough of the quality tourism. So unfortunately, we end up with the situation that once we're onto a good thing, we kind of replicate the good thing. And once we replicate the good thing, we start to get mass tourism. But there's countries which do things right. Take, for instance, Botswana. You have these huge, extraordinary concessions where you can be sort of maximum 30 people in something like 300,000–400,000 acres. So you've got these extraordinary opportunities. And if we have tourism policy driven from the top, which has got an absolutely clear long-term vision. The Botswana model started 20–30 years ago. And for 20–30 years, they've stuck on this mission of having one message out there. And their occupancies are superb. You don't get overcrowding, except in 1 or 2 tiny spots, which are almost sacrificial. But it comes down to governments need proper policies. If they have proper policies, all those things are avoided. The hassle without a proper policy, you do get that.
Would you in any way be attracted in this policy mix you're talking about for the future, attracted to the idea of in essence, creating farmed elephants or farmed rhinos or farmed lions so that they are raised, frankly, with the idea that they may not have a very long life. They may be hunted or they may, in the end, be culled for ivory. But by doing so, you feed a market, which is always going to exist, and allow truly wild creatures to survive elsewhere. You see it with lions to a certain extent in South Africa, which are farmed now, and maybe it's an idea that could be extended to elephant and rhino.
Stephen, I want to be dead when that happens. I want to be far away. It's something which I think we all came from Africa 60, 70,000 years ago. There's something about Africa inside of all of us, and that's what brings us back. Once a person goes, they go many, many times. And it's that sort of experience of the wildness. And I think it's choice. The beautiful thing about the tourism industry is it's so sophisticated that you can have choice and you can get away to these wonderful places where you find some of your inner spirit. And I think that the day that we rely on farmed animals, canned lion hunting and canned petting of lions and all that, I think we're in big trouble. I think we've got to steer away from it. But I think one thing which we haven't touched on is part of the reason why countries are struggling to put tourism high on the agenda is that a big chunk of the money doesn't go to Africa. And I think this is one of the biggest tragedies of the tourism industry, is when you look at the top, if you take sort of $1, how much of $1 a guest pays at this end ends up in Africa? And quite often, I think this is the biggest problem in the tourist industry, is that sometimes that money ends up in Guernsey, Isle of Man, Switzerland, or something like that, and not in the host country. So when the country doesn't get its full value of the dollar, then when it's got an opportunity to use oil or something like that, they go for oil because it can offer more value. Tourism needs to start absolutely producing for the host country.
So I know you've got an initiative or an idea that you believe could help that, keep money in Africa, the tourist dollar in Africa. It's a sort of percentage notion of plowing money from tourism directly into conservation programs. Explain how it would work.
Well, I think there's two avenues. First of all, the actual, whatever the guest pays. At the moment, probably 50% is ending up in the country. And when you get 50, 60% out of the dollar, at max going through, and then sometimes being hived off to a safe haven, that has to stop. And the tourism industry needs to look at itself and start seeing where is it paying money. If it's paying money and it's not going to Africa, that's the tourism we've got to stop. We've got to make sure that countries, and when a president looks at all these different industries, you can say, wow, I need to develop that and I need to protect it. I think the second thing is that the tourism industry has to start really coming up to the plate and delivering. And how can it deliver? First of all, we need much more tourists than we're getting. 5% is wrong.
See, that's scary. When you say that, that scares me. I mean, going back to my own anecdotal Kenya experience, sitting in a Land Rover at the famous wildebeest crossing, migration of across the Mara River, hundreds and hundreds of Land Rovers, and you know, frankly, because of the nature of the world economy right now, so many of them Chinese tourists who are coming on package deals to newly built, sprawling sort of prefabricated lodges. You know, a vision of a tourism in these wild places that renders them no longer wild and actually frightens the hell out of me. And you're saying you want more mass tourism.
Absolutely. No, but I don't want it. No, I don't want mass tourism, and I particularly don't want that type of tourism. I've witnessed it once. I will never go back and witness that. But if I don't go to Africa into the bush every 3-4 months, I start getting jittery. But I'll never go to those kind of places.
But then how can you glibly say we need more mass tourism?
No, not more mass tourism. More tourism which is properly controlled into proper systems like the Botswana model, like the Namibian model, like the, take for instance the Rwanda model. Rwanda model, they've got only 56 permits they're allowed per day to watch gorillas. They could comfortably, just without having any more damage on those gorillas, they could opt from 8 people per group to 12 people per group, but they don't. So what they do is they push the price up.
Right.
And that's it. The days of expecting a country in Africa to be able to host people for very little money has to go. We need to have more quality tourism, people paying more money, where more money goes to the local countries. This mass tourism, I agree with you. There's certain places, like, for instance, Victoria Falls, like Cape Town, like Cairo. No problems to have mass tourism. But in the wild areas, no. Those days must go. Those are the policies of the last 30, 40 years, which are not going to see us through to the future. We need to take the gems of Africa, the examples of Botswana, Namibia, Rwanda, and apply that across the board. If we do that, it'll be superb. Then you will have a situation where at that Mara crossing, instead of having 100 vehicles, you have 10, but they're all paying more money.
All right. Well, Charlie, I want your insight on that. You're unlike Colin, who's got long experience of the safari business, you've never actually been in the tourism trade. You've been an adventurer, an explorer, and you've been a long-time campaigner for the elephant. When Colin talks about his vision for tourism in the future that can be combined with, you know, the policies that will work for the elephant, the rhino, the lion. Do you believe this is possible?
Yes, I do. And actually, you know, a great example of an initiative in northern Kenya under the auspices of the Northern Rangelands Trust has basically engaged something like 30 different communities over 3 million acres of land who have adopted a common conservation policy whereby this 200,000, 250,000 people living in that area are now benefiting from high margin tourism with small little community-owned and managed lodges, 16-bed lodges or something like that, you know, and for the first time in their lives, they're getting significant revenue, which they never had before, coming into those communities. And what it's done is it's now given them a sense of value and ownership over their natural heritage. And what that's done is interestingly, is this particular area was, in some respects, the sort of the center of the killing fields of the elephant poaching back in the 80s. The poaching in that area now, where these communities have engaged and are benefiting from tourism, is considerably lower than it is outside those areas.
We have focused on the rhino and the elephant, but I happen to have seen in the media over the last few days some very bleak details about the situation facing the African lion. So when we talk about the threats to the big five, are we now talking far beyond the elephant and the rhino? I mean, is the lion actually now another endangered species?
Absolutely it is.
And this isn't really about poaching at all.
Well, the lion has been under threat because of loss of habitat and because of human-wildlife conflict or livestock conflict with farmers. That's been going on for time immemorial, and they've been, lions need, large areas to range over, and so they're always coming into conflict. So that's always been an issue.
How many lions are there today?
But now many experts, feel that the most likely population is in the region of 25,000, and perhaps even below 25,000 lions left in the wild today. And that's not including what we mentioned earlier, the canned lions.
The sort of reared lions.
Reared
so
lions.
So hang on, you're saying there are, in terms of lion against elephant numbers, there are only 10% as many lions as there are elephants in Africa.
Yeah, and
so we should actually, shouldn't we?
In that respect, I mean, also the lion is perhaps rarer than the rhino, if you take the combined black and white rhino populations. I mean, that is staggering. This is the king of the jungle, one of the most iconic species that we all grow up with.
And if we do go to Africa on holiday and incorporate safari, you're going to be really miserable if you don't see a lion.
Absolutely, and this is where I think, again, the tourism industry, and we clearly have a global responsibility to preserve these animals, but the tourism industry, particularly that, the tour operators trying to sell safaris, if you can't sell a guarantee to see lion, elephant, and rhino, I mean, you're down to the big three. And one of those big three is the leopard, which you don't often see anyway. So you're down to big two. It's going to make it very challenging to sell a safari.
Yeah. I mean, we must close in a second, but before we do, you've laid out the scale of the problem, and frankly, listening to you both, it would be easy to get quite depressed. But I wonder how you feel right now, despite the horrible numbers on continued poaching and everything else. Is there a degree of optimism about either of you at the moment, given where the numbers are, given where policies are from government and from the tourism industry? How would you sum up your spirits right now?
I think to be a conservationist, you've got to be an eternal optimist. And I see plenty of fantastic initiatives right across Africa. Tusk supports 50 projects across the continent. We see plenty of really great initiatives underway. But I think I'd like to also just touch on the fact that earlier this year, the British government led the way by hosting the Illegal Wildlife Trade Conference with William Hague chairing it. And there were 46 countries from around the world who came to participate in that. And that really sounded the alarm bell for how massive this problem is. And there was a real sense of momentum on the back of that conference. And I sincerely believe that the world can and will pull back from the brink and say enough is enough. And the tourism industry has a powerful voice, given the contribution it makes to GDP across the world and the vast numbers of people employed in the industry. This industry has a very powerful voice and should lobby hard to preserve its industry and the natural world.
And should work so hard to ensure it is part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Absolutely.
And Colin, you know, a final thought from you on this.
I'm less optimistic than Charlie. I think we're at the tipping point. We've got to make a conscious decision. We're going to go up and take the high road, or we're going to take the low road. If we don't bring communities meaningfully into the tourism industry, we've got no chance. And my grandkids will not have the experiences I had. I think we've got to really say, where's the money going? Who are we employing? How are we actually skilling up these people? How are we making them shareholders in our business, in our industry? If they're not shareholders at broad scale, right the way across the continent, I think we've got a bleak future.
And the industry has to contribute to conservation. It has to.
Yeah, and the policies, we have to change the policies. What's worked in the past is not going to work in the future. But on the other way around, if we do transform, I think we can save everything. We can put together the most extraordinary, sustainable tourism industry into the long term if the tourism industry comes on board and starts to embrace the reality of the new Africa today.
Well, you know what? I'm going to grab that thought and cling on to it because it's a very important one. I think this day is all about, you know, being proactive and addressing the need for solutions and looking for those practical solutions rather than just sort of throwing our hands in the air and saying.
Can I give one more point?
Yeah, go on.
Conservation without cash is a conversation. And the only way we're going to really make sure that tourism and wildlife are there in the future in these wild places, not just Africa, it's South America, it's India. It's when we have a proper conservation program, we don't have a conversation.
But you want mandatory, you know, say a 1%
no, I think
demand
tourism,
on...
No, we need tourism to start bringing in proper quantities of the right paying tourist into our areas. And if we get the cash from tourism, we can survive. Wildlife can be there forever.
All right, we'll leave that thought hanging in the air. But ladies and gentlemen, please give a very, very warm hand to Colin Bell and to Charlie Mayhew. Thank you both very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much. Could I invite you to return to your seats? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do a very swift stage set change. Not much of one, but a little stage set change. Just get ready for our awards ceremony. As I said before, I know many of you sitting in this auditorium are on tenterhooks, hoping against hope that you are an award winner this year. You're all, in a sense, if you've come here, part of the success story because you have been nominated for one of the 12 awards we are going to hand out right now. So I congratulate you already for your success and for being invited here today. We're going to make sure we're all ready for the award ceremony. I'm just going to be your sort of master of ceremonies. I'm not going to be handing out the awards myself, but I will be telling you about all of the brilliant projects and businesses that have been nominated. So just bear with us for a moment longer and we'll begin the awards ceremony.